During the early years of the Galactic Civil War, the Alliance to restore the Republic primarily relied on smaller capital ships to fill out its space forces, favouring quick-paced guerrilla tactics over traditional ship-to-ship engagements. But sometimes, the Alliance would have to bring out the heavy hitters, and that was when the core of the Rebel fleet would take the field. This was a collection of cruisers and various classes, many of them designed by the famed Mon Calamari shipyards, and in the Galactic Civil War's most important space battles, they were the Rebellion's answer to the Imperial Navy's Star Destroyers.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
For most of the early Galactic Civil War, the Alliance kept the famed Rebel fleet in its back pocket. Only small battle groups were detached from the fleet for most engagements, while the main fleet stuck to remote regions of space, always on the move. The Rebel fleet served more as a symbol and as a mobile command base for most of the war, but in a few crucial engagements, most notably the evacuation of Yavin and the Battle of Endor, the Rebel fleet engaged the Imperial Navy at full strength, and when it did, it fought differently than the smaller Rebel battle groups. When the full strength of the Rebel fleet was brought to bear, the Alliance could fight on even terms with the Imperial Navy, to the misfortune of many an Imperial captain. The Rebel fleet maintained a stockpile of large capital ships for those battles, most notably a mix of cruisers, heavy cruisers, and even larger vessels. By the standards of professional navies, cruisers were medium-sized ships, but since the Alliance had very few capital ships that were larger than cruiser size, they were considered large by Rebel standards. Under the Anaxis War College classification system, cruisers were divided into two categories. The basic cruiser class included light and medium cruisers, and it consisted of all capital ships between 400 and 600 meters in length. There were also heavy cruisers, which were between 600 and 1000 meters in length, and which were generally more heavily armored, and a bit slower. Both types of cruisers were usually very well rounded, with a decent balance of firepower, defenses, speed, and maneuverability, and they could perform in a number of roles reasonably well. The Rebel fleet used its cruisers primarily for engaging capital ships and leading fleets of smaller vessels, as well as for protecting the Rebel fleet's few truly large ships. The Anaxis War College system classified capital ships between 1,000 and 2,000 meters long as Star Destroyers, but since that term was strongly associated with the Empire, the Alliance didn't use it. Instead, its large Star Destroyer type ships were classified as Star Cruisers, and they filled more or less the same role as the Imperial equivalent. They were mainline battleships meant for use as capital ship killers, starfighter carriers, and flagships. The Alliance also had a handful of small battle cruisers, or capital ships, between 2 to 5 kilometers in length, and these filled similar roles to the Rebel fleet's Star Cruisers. Let's start by taking a look at the Rebel fleet's light and medium cruisers, beginning with the Liberator class cruiser. This angular medium cruiser was designed for the Celestin Home Guard by the Sorrow Sub Corporation, but several of them fell into Rebel hands, and after the Celestins joined the Rebel Alliance, many more became part of the Rebel fleet. The Liberator was designed for an anti-piracy role, meant to destroy fleets of smaller capital ships on its own, and it was very effective in this role. However, it struggled in combat against swarms of fast-moving starfighters. The Liberator was on the smaller side for a cruiser, and it consisted of a flat, blocky central section flanked by 2 triangular, downswept wings which extended forward from the ship's central section. This cruiser was considered one of the galaxy's most advanced warships, packed full of cutting-edge technology, including next-generation drive engines and an efficient hyperdrive. The Liberator was fairly agile, and it featured exceptionally dense armor and strong shields, allowing it to withstand far more punishment than most small cruisers. The cruiser featured a fairly spacious internal hangars, which were accessed from the front of the central section and which could carry up to 6 starfighter squadrons. The Liberator could also carry up to 3 regiments of embarked troops, and it was armed with numerous turbo lasers, ion cannons, and tractor beam projectors. All told, the Liberator cruiser was very well rounded, and the Alliance used it in many detached battle groups beginning after the Battle of Yavin. It excelled at destroying Imperial capital ships, and although it required support to deal with TIE fighter squadrons, it was still one of the Rebellion's most formidable frontline ships. Another commonly used Rebel cruiser class was the Neutron Star class bulk cruiser, an outdated but still effective patrol vessel. The Neutron Star was designed by Rendili Stardrive, and it was what Rendili's more well-known Dreadnought heavy cruiser would look like if the midsection got squashed and the front was ripped off. The Neutron Star was meant to be a second-line ship, providing supporting fire for heavy cruisers in ship-to-ship battles, and it was originally designed late in the Clone Wars for the Republic Navy. However, the Clone Wars ended before it premiered, and the Imperial Navy had no interest in it. Instead, Neutron Star cruisers were mainly used by the local fleets of poor sectors as a patrol craft, or even as a bulk freighter by private citizens. They were easy enough to acquire, however, so the Rebel fleet had a fair few of them, which the Alliance used despite how obsolete they had become. The Neutron Star was 600 meters long, and its engines were both slow and inefficient, burning large amounts of fuel and thus limiting the cruiser's range. Its Class 2 hyperdrive worked better, but the Neutron Star was still sluggish and high maintenance on the whole. It required a crew of 2,050, 1,993 crew and 57 gunners. It could carry up to 2,000 passengers, and the stock model had no hangar bays. It could carry 5,000 tons of cargo, and ostensibly, it also carried a year of consumables. The Neutron Star was neither well armored nor well shielded, as it was meant to be a midline ship, but it was at least heavily armed, boasting 24 heavy turbo lasers, 25 heavy laser cannons, and 2 heavy tractor beam emitters, which gave it some pretty serious firepower. 4 heavy turbo lasers and the tractor beam projectors were mounted to the vessel's fore, while the remainder of its arsenal was clustered along the cruiser's sides. The Alliance used the stock Neutron Star as a capital ship killer, and it was fairly effective, though it required support from other ships to be effective a lot of the time. However, many Neutron Star cruisers in the Rebel fleet were modified to serve as cruiser carriers, which made them far more effective. These modified cruisers had a far lower passenger carrying capacity, 200 as opposed to 2,000, and their weaponry was different, with the original Neutron Star's turbo lasers and laser cannons swapped for 30 quad laser cannons, divided evenly between forward, port, and starboard. These reductions were a trade-off for the addition of hangars, which could carry up to 36 starfighters, which made the Neutron Star a far more versatile addition to the Rebel fleet groups. Much of the Rebel fleet's midline cruiser tier was filled out by the MC-40A light cruiser, a Mon Calamari shipyard's design. Designed for anti-capital ship action and light fighter support, the MC-40A was highly modular, like all Mon Calamari ships. Ships of the class measured between 500 and 600 meters in length, and they followed a simple bullet-shaped design with a sleek, bulbous hull marked with blisters and conning towers, like most other Mon Calamari ships. The cruiser's trio of engines gave it a high thrust-to-mass ratio, making it very fast and maneuverable for a cruiser of its size. It had a Class 1 hyperdrive, a well-armored hull, and stronger shields than most cruisers, which allowed the MC-40A to soak up plenty of punishment. The MC-40A was equipped with starfighter hangars and could carry a single squadron into battle. It had a crew of 3,758, 3,723 crew and 35 gunners, and it could carry 650 embarked troops and 2 years worth of consumables. The MC-40A was armed with 14 medium turbo laser turrets, 16 medium ion cannons, 6 heavy tractor beam projectors, and 2 concussion missile launchers, with capacity for 25 concussion missiles each. All told, the MC-40A had enough firepower to engage and destroy smaller enemy capital ships, and its shields could withstand fire from much larger vessels. It was an all-round effective capital ship, and it was the Alliance's most commonly used cruiser class, in the years leading up to the Battle of Endor. MC-40A cruisers served as flagships for small task forces, and when among the full Rebel fleet, they served as escorts for the larger Mon Calamari star cruisers, providing fire support against larger Imperial vessels. The Alliance also made occasional use of two Imperial light cruiser classes. The first of these was the Ton Falk class escort carrier, designed by Kuat Drive Yards and intended for use as a heavy carrier. The Ton Falk was designed to deploy large numbers of starfighters, and originally, it was meant as a counter to the advantages of the Alliance's hyperspace-capable fighter classes, allowing commanders to deploy TIE fighters with comparable flexibility and efficiency. In Alliance hands, these carriers instead served as mobile bases for Alliance Starfighter Command, similar to the smaller Quasar Fire class frigate. These cruisers were 500 meters long, and they had a rather bizarre design, especially for an Imperial ship. The Ton Falk class was essentially a heavily armored blob, with an engine block and the back and hangar portals at the front. In real space, it was rather sluggish, but its Class 1 hyperdrive was top of the line, allowing it to get across the galaxy fast. For a cruiser of its size, its shields were average and its hull armoring was rather weak, making the Ton Falk a bit of a fragile ship, not meant for the front lines. It required a crew of 3,505 with 3,485 crew and 20 gunners, and it could also carry 800 pilots and embarked troops, as well as 1,000 to 5,000 tons of cargo and 9 months to a year of consumables, depending on the configuration. Of course, as a dedicated carrier, the Ton Falk's main feature was its large hangar bay, which could store and maintain large numbers of starfighters. All told, these hangars could carry up to 72 starfighters, 6 shuttles or landing craft, and an unknown complement of utility vehicles. This large fighter wing made the cruiser a serious threat, but the Ton Falk had very little firepower on its own, boasting just 10 tame and buck H8 dual-point defense laser cannons, 4 tractor-beam projectors, and a single VL-6 warhead launcher with a capacity of 60 concussion missiles. This arsenal was mainly meant for defense against incoming fighters, leaving the Ton Falk almost entirely unable to defend itself against capital ships. This, plus its limited durability, made this a strictly backline cruiser meant to deploy and support its fighters and nothing else. The Alliance mainly used the few Ton Falks it had as mobile starfighter bases, though it also sometimes attached them to Rebel battle groups. The Rebels' other captured Imperial cruiser class was the Loronar Corporation Strike-class medium cruiser, which the Alliance modified into the lazily named Modified Strike Cruiser. The original Strike Cruiser was a bulbous, bullet-shaped vessel with a prominent dorsal conning tower and aft engine cluster, and it was designed as a cheap, modular, general-purpose vessel. The Alliance's Modified Strike Cruiser was built on the same frame, but it featured 2 bulbous side protrusions along the midsection which housed gravity well projectors ripped from Imperial interdictor ships, and it served as an interdictor class of the Rebellion's own. The Modified Strike Cruiser was 451 meters long, 271.9 meters wide, and 103.95 meters high. It was propelled by just 2 sublight engines and was somewhat sluggish in real space. Its hyperdrive rating is unknown. Its hull was much tougher than the smaller Ton Falks, and its shields were quite strong. The cruiser had a crew of 1,000 personnel, and it was armed with just 2 quad laser cannons alongside its 4 gravity well projectors. It was very lacking for firepower, but its gravity well projectors nonetheless allowed it to serve effectively as an interdictor, ripping Imperial ships out of hyperspace so that other Rebel capitals could finish them off. The Alliance upgraded its captured Strike-class cruisers into modified strike cruisers at the shipyard Kalens, stationed in the Nocto system. These ships were the Rebel fleet's main interdictor classes until after the destruction of the Nocto shipyards in 3 ABY, after which the modified strike cruiser fell out of use, replaced by more capable CC-7700 interdictors and captured Imperial immobilizer cruisers. Another Imperial capital ship that the Alliance made extensive use of was the ubiquitous Dreadnought-class heavy cruiser. Originally designed for use by the Republic, Dreadnought cruisers were very common, used by everyone from the Empire to the corporate sector authority, and the Rebellion was able to get its hands on a few of them fairly easily. These ships were tough and dependable, if outdated and inefficient. The Dreadnought-class heavy cruiser was manufactured by Rendili Stardrive, designed for use in planetary blockades and large fleet battles, and it was highly effective in ship-to-ship combat. The Dreadnought was 600 meters long and had a blocky, elongated design, with a larger aft section and a rounded, clamshell-like fore. The aft end of the ship was largely taken up by the heavy cruiser's power core, which was notoriously inefficient, as well as its sluggish Class 4 hyperdrive and its array of 6 ion engines, which were slow and had poor maneuverability. But what the Dreadnought lacked in speed, it made up for in other systems. The heavy cruiser's 2 medium-range sensor transceivers were fairly powerful, and the Dreadnought was durable as hell, with a tough, heavily armored hull and powerful deflector shields, which were projected from generators housed in broadside blisters. The Dreadnought had large cargo bays that could be partially converted into small starfighter hangars, which could carry a dozen starfighters and multiple shuttles, while still having room for a year's worth of consumables. Unmodified Dreadnoughts could carry 9,000 tons of cargo and 2 years of consumables. This immense cargo space was necessary because of the Dreadnought's obscenely large crew. A fully crewed stock Dreadnought was manned by 16,210 personnel, consisting of 16,113 crew and 97 gunners, and it could also carry 3,000 troops as passengers. A Dreadnought could still run effectively on a smaller crew of 9,000, but that was still pretty ridiculous for such a relatively small ship. Dreadnought heavy cruisers' weapon mounts were highly modular, allowing for a variety of weapon configurations. The average Dreadnought was armed with 10 medium turbo lasers, 20 light quad turbo lasers, and 20 heavy laser cannons. The quad turbo lasers and laser cannons were usually arrayed along the sides, clustered in large blisters on the midsection, while the medium turbo lasers were divided evenly between the front and aft ends of the ship. But almost all of the Alliance's Dreadnoughts were highly modified, and many had additional weaponry such as point defense ion cannons and concussion missile launchers. Among the modified Dreadnoughts in the Rebel fleet included the fleet's original flagship, a former museum ship that Mon Mothma's Chandrilan faction had stolen, the New Hope. The Alliance also made use of 2 classes of very heavily modified Dreadnought heavy cruisers, the Assault Frigate Mark I and the Assault Frigate Mark II. The Mark I, at least, partly resembled the original Dreadnought, with the original clamshell foresection and the weapons blisters, but the forward section had 2 jumbled ventral spires added on, while the aft was replaced with a clump of different modules with a large, shark-like fin added toward the aft end. Much of the ship's new internal superstructure was exposed to space and entirely crewed by droids. Other Mark I variants combined the forward section of the Dreadnought with parts of the Nebulon B-2 frigate. These hybrid cruisers were 700 meters long and were faster than the stock Dreadnought, with more fuel-efficient engines and a Class 2 hyperdrive. Mark I's had stronger shields but less durable hulls than their predecessors, and their crew requirements were greatly reduced, dropping to a crew of exactly 5,000. 4,882 crew and 112 gunners, with a minimum crew of 1,500. The Mark I assault frigate could also carry 100 passengers, a year and a half of consumables, and 7,500 metric tons of cargo. The ship had no hangars, but it had external umbilical docks for 20 starfighters, plus a specialized docking cradle for an ATR-6 assault transport. The assault frigate Mark I was armed with 15 turbo laser batteries, 20 quad laser cannons, and 15 laser cannons. The turbo lasers and laser cannons were evenly divided between 4 port and starboard, while 8 of the quad lasers had forward firing arcs, with the remaining 12 divided between the sides of the ship. The assault frigate Mark I was one of the most effective heavy cruisers in the Rebel fleet, despite its haphazard construction, improving on the functionality of the original Dreadnought. Mark 1s were primarily deployed during large-scale fleet actions, and they had a high survivability. By the Battle of Endor, not a single one of the Alliance's Mark 1s had been destroyed. The assault frigate Mark II, meanwhile, was a rarely seen further modification of the Mark I assault frigate designed by renegade Rendili Star Drive engineers. This ship looked absolutely nothing like the original Dreadnought. It was a jumbled cluster of vaguely bullet-shaped modules with 4 downswept wings extending out from the rear, incorporating many of the latest Rendili and Mon Calamari design advances. The ship was 400 meters long, and its weaponry, speed, hyperdrive capabilities, and cargo and passenger capacities were all identical to the Mark I assault frigate. However, the Mark I further reduced the crew requirement to 4,820, and it also featured Mon Calamari shield generators, which were more powerful and regenerated faster than the shields of the Mark I. Nonetheless, the assault frigate Mark II was rarely seen, and it was ultimately outlasted by its predecessor, with which it shared the same niche in the Rebel fleet. A handful of the Rebel fleet's larger ships were old, repurposed Clone Wars era vessels. The Alliance had at least one former Republic Navy Acclamator-class assault ship, and it was rumored to have seized a few Victory-class Star Destroyers at the start of the Galactic Civil War, though these were all destroyed or recaptured by the Empire in short order. For the most part though, the Alliance's stock of former Clone Wars vessels came from the Confederate Navy, not the Republic Navy. The Rebellion was careful about using former Separatist assets, as the Alliance's leaders wanted to avoid association with the CIS, but in the early Galactic Civil War, these ships made up the core of the Rebel fleet. The Alliance had at least one Recusant-class light destroyer, a destroyer class that had formerly been common in the CIS Navy. This ship was actually originally designed by the Mon Calamari shipyards, but the design was stolen by Quarren separatists and given to Horsch Kessel Drive, Incorporated. Horsch Kessel and the Free Duck Volunteer Engineering Corps manufactured hundreds of thousands of these ships during the Clone Wars, and many fell into private hands after the end of the war, including the hands of various rebel cells. The Recusant was originally designed as a capital ship killer and privateer ship, and it served the Rebellion effectively in those roles, as well as a command ship. These 1,187 meter long destroyers were skeletal in design, with a thin, beam-like aft section ringed by a cluster of 3 engines, and a bulkier forward section buried under layers of shell-like armor plating. It was a decently fast ship, with a Class 2 hyperdrive and a maximum acceleration of 2,800 Gs in open space. Its shielding was quite tough, but its hull was fragile and very lightly armored, meaning that a Recusant without shields was pretty much dead in the water. The ship could carry 10,000 tons of cargo and 2 years worth of consumables, and originally, the Recusant was mostly automated and operated by a skeleton crew of just a few hundred battle droids. Alliance Recusant destroyers, however, were modified to accommodate much larger organic crews, as well as thousands of embarked troops. The standard model Recusant lacked starfighter hangars, but it was heavily armed, boasting a super heavy dual turbo laser on its prow, plus 4 heavy turbo laser cannons, 6 heavy turbo laser turrets, 5 regular turbo laser cannons, 30 dual laser cannons, 12 dual light laser cannons, and 60 point defense light laser cannons. Among the Alliance's most powerful capital ships were a handful of old Lucrehulk class battleships, including the Fortressa, which the Rebel fleet used as a supercarrier and command ship. These were by far the largest ships the Alliance had at its disposal, and unfortunately for the Rebellion, they didn't last long in Alliance service. Lucrehulk battleships were converted Lucrehulk class LH-3210 cargo freighters, originally manufactured by Horsch Kessel for the Trade Federation. They were a whopping 3,170 meters long, and they were both densely armored and extremely well shielded, with some of the most powerful shield systems of any Clone Wars era capital ship. The battleship had a maximum atmospheric speed of 500 kilometers per hour and a maximum acceleration of 300 Gs in open space, and it was equipped with a Class 2 hyperdrive. The crew requirements and exact armament of a Rebel Lucrehulk battleship is unknown, though it at least included dozens of heavy quad laser turrets. The main asset of these massive ships, of course, was their enormous hangar arms, which could carry whole armies and vast swarms of starfighters with room to spare for 5 million tons of cargo. The Fortresser, the only rebel Lucrehulk we have any information about, carried a whopping 500 X-Wing starfighters, making it the rebel fleet's highest capacity carrier. This high capacity was also why the Fortresser was chosen for its final mission. During Operation Skyhook, the Alliance learned that the Death Star was located in the Horus system, where it was in the final stages of construction, and the Fortresser was dispatched to destroy, or at least cripple, the battle station. The idea was that the battleship's enormous fighter wings stood a good chance of getting past the Imperial fleet protecting the Death Star, allowing them to at least attempt to damage the superweapon. Instead, the Fortresser was subjected to a low-power test firing from the Death Star's superlaser, which atomized the battleship, leaving its fighter wing to be mopped up by the Death Star's ties. This was the first and last known engagement in which the Alliance deployed a Lucrehulk battleship, and it convinced Alliance Command that they didn't stand a chance of destroying the Death Star without first getting a hold of the station's schematics. The Rebel fleet also contained a heavily modified Providence-class carrier/destroyer called Rebel 1, which took over from the New Hope as the fleet's flagship during the early years of the Galactic Civil War, from about 2 BBY to 6 months after the Battle of Yavin. Most of Rebel 1 was similar to the stock Providence class, but it had a large shell-like addition over the aft section, which featured a pair of stubby wings and additional engine units. It was equipped with a Class 1.5 hyperdrive and carried several squadrons of Y-Wings and X-Wings. Its other stats are all unknown. During its time as flagship of the Rebel fleet, Rebel 1 served as a mobile command base, always remaining with the core of the fleet. However, 6 months after the Battle of Yavin, Rebel 1 was severely damaged in the disaster at Deep Space Besh, a devastating ambush in which the Rebel fleet came under attack from the full force of the Imperial Navy. This ambush saw the destruction of many of the Rebel fleet's larger ships, including most of its former Separatist warships. Rebel 1 was the only former Separatist ship to escape thanks to a blind hyperspace jump, but it was ultimately abandoned and scuttled by the Alliance shortly thereafter. The loss of the Rebel 1 was a blow to the Rebel fleet, but fortunately, the Mon Calamari were able to supply new large warships to fill the void left by the Separatist vessels, including the fleet's third and final flagship, the Independence. By far, the most well-known large capital ships in the Rebel fleet were the iconic Mon Calamari Star Cruisers. Despite their iconic status, however, they're tricky to nail down stats for, and for a simple reason. The Mon Calamari were artisan shipbuilders, and even in a time of war, the ships they made were works of art. Every single capital ship built at the Mon Calamari shipyards was unique, and though Mon Calamari warships can be grouped into semi-standardized classes, there were still differences between the ships of the class. As a result, the stats we present will be the stats for your average Mon Calamari ship of each specific subclass. In Legends, all of the Star Cruiser type Mon Calamari warships seen in the Rebel fleet were modified Mon Calamari shipyards MC-80 Star Cruisers. These ships were originally designed as exploration vessels and luxury passenger liners back before the Clone Wars, but after the Mon Calamari threw off the Empire and allied with the Rebel Alliance, it converted all the MC-80s available into warships, and the Mon Calamari shipyards began building new MC-80s that were specifically designed for combat duty. These ships made up the core of the Rebel fleet, acting as flagships, command cruisers, starfighter carriers, and frontline battleships. They were well-rounded, able to lead smaller task forces into battle or fight effectively as a combined fleet, and they were highly effective in ship-to-ship combat. There were several MC-80 variants in service with the Rebel fleet, some of which differed greatly from one another. There were 3 primary subtypes: the MC-80A Star Cruiser, the MC-80A Home 1 type Heavy Star Cruiser, and the MC-80 Liberty type Heavy Star Cruiser. We'll start with the Home 1 type, since that's the one we have the most detailed information for. The MC-80A Home 1 type Heavy Star Cruiser, also known as the MC-80 Command Cruiser, served the Rebellion as a command ship, a battleship, and sometimes as a carrier, leading the rebel fleet into battle. The flagship of the rebel fleet, the Independence, was of this class, as was Admiral Akbar's other flagship, Home 1. Typically, these ships were 1,200 meters long, while some ships of the class were 1,400 meters long or longer, with some being so large that they would be classed as battle cruisers rather than star cruisers. The Home 1, the class namesake, was 1,300 meters long. Though their exact designs varied, the general shape of the ship was the same. Command MC-80As were long, vaguely cylindrical and bulbous, with smooth, organic-looking hulls, tapered bows, and round sterns surrounded by engine clusters, with numerous blister-like structures protruding from the hull. The Command MC-80A was powered by a single massive reactor, similar in size and power output to that of an Imperial Star Destroyer. This reactor was housed toward the aft end of the ship, surrounded by the main drive engines. Aft of the reactor, housed within the rounded section that made up the Star Cruiser's stern, was the MC-80's massive tri-lunar 400 mg star drive and hyperdrive system. The hyperdrive generator was directly connected to the reactor through a complex interface, while the hyperdrive field emitter was located at the very aft end of the assembly. This hyperdrive was rated as a Class 1, and the MC-80A also had a backup hyperdrive which was rated as a Class 9. For real space propulsion, the Command MC-80A relied on a network of 10 ion engines which were clustered around the main reactor. Primary propulsion was provided by 4 M8.0 star drive engines clustered around the stern, while 6 adjacent M4.5 star drive maneuvering engines provided additional thrust and maneuvering. Due to the power and number of these engines, the Home 1 type was fast and maneuverable for its size, able to keep pace with an Imperial Star Destroyer. The hulls of MC-80 Star Cruisers, the Home 1 type included, were composed of layers of flattened, ribbon-like structural beams which were covered in external layers of heavy armor, making the ships extremely resilient. While many of these ships, among them Home 1, had once featured thousands of external viewports, many of these were buried beneath thick layers of plating after being converted into warships. The Command MC-80A also featured extremely strong, triple redundant, fast regenerating deflector shields, which kept the Star Cruiser thoroughly protected. These shields were as strong as those of an Imperial Star Destroyer, but the advanced Mon Calamari design of the shield generators added redundancies and fast shield generation that Imperial shield generators lacked. The MC-80A had several deflector shield generators that were buried deep in the ship's interior, and they were connected to a scattering of shield projectors located across the outer hull. These projectors consisted of a ring of projector vanes housed within an armored shell, and they filled several of the blisters on the Star Cruiser's hull. The MC-80A was also equipped with a Serage Seal emergency shielding system to seal hull breaches. Some MC-80A command ships, including Home 1, were modified so that parts of the ship could split off to operate independently. Home 1 had 2 of these detachable ships which could function as completely independent spacecraft. These could be used as enormous lifeboats, independent frigates, or massive troop transports. The main sub-ship fit into an enormous slot toward the aft end of the Home 1 along the ship's dorsal spine, and was roughly a quarter of the Home 1's length. This main shuttle contained Home 1's command decks, as well as cargo bays and barracks, and it was capable of conducting planetary landings. It could be used as an escape craft for the Star Cruiser's command crew if need be, but it was mainly used to transport large numbers of personnel and cargo between Home 1 and planetary surfaces. The secondary passenger shuttle was much smaller, and it fit into a slot toward the forward end of the ship, also along the dorsal spine. Both subships had their own internal reactor systems and drive engines, and they slotted smoothly into the Home 1's hull, appearing to be nothing more than especially large hull blisters when docked. Docking clamps held the shuttles in place when docked, while a series of umbilicals connected them to the ship's main systems. These subships provided the commanders of MC-80A command cruisers with a lot of tactical flexibility. Although Home 1's commander, Admiral Akbar, preferred to keep the different parts of his flagship united when possible. Apart from the 2 subships, MC-80A command cruisers featured numerous escape pods scattered across the ship, allowing the vessel's crew to evacuate if the ship was ever crippled. The ship boasted a wealth of long-range sensors and communication systems housed in the bow and in blisters scattered across the ship, and they also had substantial storage space with capacity for a whopping 20,000 tons of cargo plus 2 years worth of consumables. Most MC-80A command cruisers had crews of between 5,402 and 5,480 personnel, with a minimum crew of 1,230, which was pretty small for a ship of this size. Home 1 had a crew of 5,500. Since the controls on most crew stations were designed for the Mon Calamari's hands and the different visual spectrum they saw in, most Mon Calamari star cruisers were crewed primarily by Mon Calamari, who typically made up the entirety of these vessels' command crews, with non-Calamari usually serving in secondary roles. Apart from their crews, MC-80A command cruisers usually carried 1,200 passengers, embarked troops, and/or support staff, and they had fairly spacious and comfortable interiors since they were designed as passenger liners and not warships. A complex main atmospheric processing plant at the very center of the Star Cruiser could produce a variety of different atmosphere mixes to suit the preferences of many different species, with the different atmosphere mixes pumped to different sections of the ship via a tangled network of internal ducts which wound their way through the ship's superstructure. Originally, the Home 1 and other ships of its type featured similarly complex networks of water-filled tubes, which Mon Calamari could use to swim between different decks rather than using turbolifts. Many of the tubes on the rebel ships were drained and fitted with flooring, stairs, and ventilation for the benefit of non-water breathers. The Star Cruiser's crew spaces were spread all across the ship, with the largest concentrations being at the forward end and around the hangars. Personal quarters were small but comfortable, and the ships featured a wealth of crew support and recreational facilities. Many MC-80As still had observation decks from their time as exploration vessels, while the Home 1 also had a large central atrium at the heart of the ship, which contained an artificial lagoon ringed with sandy beaches and an artificial forest with a small island at the heart of the pool. Crew and passengers could go there to relax, and many of the ship's quarters had windows looking out into this atrium. The interior of the Independence was divided into 4 quadrants, with the bow quadrant given over to navigation and tactical planning for the rebel fleet, and the aft quadrant housing the pilots' areas. The flight ops sections included a simulation room, multiple flight simulators, briefing rooms, ready rooms, a tactical theater, and a lounge with a makeshift bar, while the administrative quadrant contained the intelligence center, where rebel intelligence was headquartered, as well as an auditorium for award ceremonies, a private office belonging to Mon Mothma, and several lecture halls. Other parts of the ship contained mess halls, dining rooms for officers and VIPs, a medical bay, and a ballroom that had been converted into a meeting place for the engineering and administrative staff. Home 1 type MC-80s had multiple command modules, which were pill-shaped and housed atop short conning towers. One of these housed the Star Cruiser's command suites, including the main bridge and a large briefing room. All MC-80A command cruisers had hangars, but the size and number of these varied from ship to ship. The hangars of the original MC-80 Star Cruisers were only meant for shuttle traffic, but many MC-80As had their hangars greatly expanded to allow the ships to serve as starfighter carriers. Home 1 had a total of 20 hangars, including 2 large hangars that could handle vessels as large as light freighters, which were located on the starboard side of the midsection and the underside of the aft section. The starboard hangar was Home 1's main hangar and housed multiple starfighter squadrons. It was connected to a pair of smaller hangars on the ship's port side by a large tunnel, while a series of elevators connected it to a series of lower hangar bays, which were dedicated to starfighter storage and maintenance. The Independence, meanwhile, had 2 large main hangars, one on either side of the ship, while the large ventral hangar served as a repair bay and auxiliary hangar, mainly handling shuttle traffic. The Independence's main hangars each serviced 2 squadrons of starfighters, while the lower hangars beneath them could service another 3 squadrons per side. Despite their different configurations, both the Independence and the Home 1 had the same carrying capacity: 120 starfighters in 10 squadrons, typically a mix of X-Wings, Y-Wings, A-Wings, and B-Wings, plus a variety of shuttles, gunboats, landing craft, personnel carriers, and ground vehicles. Some MC-80As had capacities as low as 36 starfighters, however, due to varying hangar structures. Armament also varied drastically from ship to ship, though weapon batteries were almost always spread fairly evenly across the Star Cruiser's hull, housed in the ship's blisters. MC-80A command cruisers generally had between 29 and 36 twin or quad heavy turbo laser batteries, 36 twin ion cannon batteries, 80 quad laser cannon batteries, and 6 heavy tractor beam projectors. Both Home 1 and Independence boasted 36 XV9 dual heavy turbo laser batteries, 36 SW7 dual heavy ion cannon batteries, and 6 Q7 heavy tractor beam projectors. Generally, the MC-80s lacked point defense batteries, as their turbo lasers were precise enough to be able to shoot down starfighters, though they were also powerful enough to destroy capital ships and conduct planetary bombardments. This arsenal gave the Home 1 type considerable stopping power, and its precision gave the Star Cruiser tactical flexibility. The Rebel fleet contained at least 7 Home 1 type MC-80s, among them the Independence, the Rebel fleet's flagship, the Home 1, the auxiliary flagship, and the Defiance. All 3 ships were originally deep space exploration vessels meant to make contact with undiscovered alien species, but they were retrofitted into battleships early in the Galactic Civil War after the Mon Calamari began covertly aiding the Rebel Alliance. After the destruction of the Rebel 1, the Independence became the Rebel fleet's flagship, responsible for overseeing all fleet operations on a galactic scale. Independence served as a mobile command center for the rebellion, and Mon Mothma spent most of the Galactic Civil War aboard, overseeing the political aspects of the rebellion from the ship. After the Battle of Hoth deprived the Alliance of its latest planetary command base, Echo Base's former command staff relocated to Home 1, which took over the roles the Alliance's planetary bases had formerly served. The other Home 1 type MC-80s in the Rebel fleet were all lesser command ships, occasionally detached from the main fleet to command large task forces. These ships excelled in ship-to-ship combat, as they were able to stand up and destroy Imperial Star Destroyers, and they also often served as starfighter carriers. All of the MC-80A command cruisers the Rebel fleet had available joined the assault on the second Death Star during the Battle of Endor. Admiral Akbar oversaw the battle from the bridge of the Home 1, while the Independence served as the fleet's communications control ship. After the Home 1 type, the MC-80 Liberty-type heavy star cruiser was probably the most recognizable MC-80 variant. Coming in at 1,200 to 1,500 meters long, these heavy star cruisers had a long set of wings along their sides, which flared out toward the aft end, giving them a rocket-like silhouette. These wings boasted additional engines and weapon systems, in keeping with the Liberty type's typical role as a frontline ship, meant to engage and destroy enemy capital ships. Some also served as carriers, though not as commonly as the Home 1 type. The Liberty type's power and propulsion systems were arranged much differently from those of the other MC-80 star cruisers, with the reactor being located further aft and the starship's engines all packed together into a dense engine block below it. This engine block contained 9 ion engines of 3 different types, which gave the Liberty a maximum acceleration of 2,750 Gs in open space. The vessel's hyperdrive systems, heavy armor, and fast regenerating Mon Calamari shields were all functionally identical to those on other MC-80s, and like the Home 1 type, the Liberty type had a powerful long-range sensor suite, which was housed in a large ventral blister amidships. Liberty type MC-80s were operated by a crew of 5,402, a mix of 4,734 enlisted personnel and 668 officers, and they could carry 1,200 passengers and/or embarked troops, although some ships of this size, including the heavy star cruiser Justice, could carry almost 8,000 troops. Typically, Liberty-type MC-80s carried 3 starfighter squadrons, 1 X-Wing squadron, 1 Y-Wing squadron, and 1 A-Wing squadron. Again, the Justice, which could carry a total of 10 squadrons and had expanded hangars, was an exception. Liberty-type MC-80s were more heavily armed than the Home 1 type, with the average ship of the class boasting 48 heavy turbo laser batteries, 20 SW7 heavy ion cannon batteries, and 6 heavy tractor beam projectors. Most of these ships also had several cluster bomb launchers for anti-starfighter interception, though their turbo lasers were also accurate enough for use in point defense. The Liberty's turbo lasers and ion cannons were split evenly between 4 aft, port, and starboard firing arcs, and many were clustered on the wings, which also housed the heavy tractor beam projectors. This impressive arsenal allowed the Liberty type to stand up to all but the largest Imperial capital ships without fleet support, making it the Alliance's most reliable heavy battleship class. The original Liberty-type MC-80s, including the Liberty and the Justice, were among the oldest MC-80s in service, and they were the first ships the Mon Calamari converted into warships after throwing off the Empire. They served the rebellion well in many battles, as they were often detached from the rebel fleet to lead task forces into battle. The Liberty itself became famous within the Alliance, as it had not only fought in the Mon Calamari's revolution against the Empire, but it had also led the fleet that destroyed the Super Star Destroyer Vengeance and carried out a campaign of hit-and-run attacks against the Imperial Navy after the Battle of Hoth. The Liberty's last battle was the Battle of Endor, when it earned a less celebrated distinction. It was the first ship to be destroyed by the second Death Star's superlaser. The last major MC-80 variant was simply known as the MC-80A Star Cruiser, with a lowercase a rather than the uppercase A used for the Home 1 type. This variant of the MC-80 entered production after the liberation of Dak, and was explicitly designed to be a warship in the Rebel fleet, unlike the other variants. It was leaner, more efficient, and more powerful than its predecessors, and saw extensive use as a carrier battleship. It was 1,200 meters long and resembled a wingless Liberty type, propelled by a cluster of 10 engines crowded together at the stern. The MC-80A had the same maximum speed as the Home 1 type, as well as the same hyperdrive, shield system, and heavy armor. Its crew requirements and passenger complement were identical to the Liberty's, but it had a larger starfighter carrying capacity. The MC-80A had 3 main hangars that could carry 6 squadrons of starfighters between them, typically 2 X-Wing squadrons, 3 Y-Wing squadrons, and an A-Wing squadron. The MC-80A was armed with 48 Tame and Buck XV9 turbolaser batteries, and possibly other weapons as well. While the Home 1 type was a dedicated command ship and supercarrier, and while the Liberty was a heavily armed frontline heavy battleship, the MC-80A Star Cruiser was more well-rounded. It could serve as a battleship, carrier, and command ship, but it balanced those roles more than the other variants did. It saw less use as a flagship than the other 2 classes, and it mainly served as a ship of the line in the main Rebel fleet, providing fire support for the Independence, Home 1, and the rest against the frontline ships of the Imperial Navy. At least 10 Star Cruisers of this class participated in the Battle of Endor, helping Home 1 and a squadron of Liberty types cripple the Star Dreadnought, Executor. Finally, the Rebellion made use of 2 other large non-Mon Calamari capital ship classes, the first of which was the Dauntless class heavy cruiser. Despite the name, this was actually a destroyer coming in at more than 1,200 meters in length. It looked fairly similar to Mon Calamari ships, with a smooth, bulbous, elongated main hull covered in blisters, though it had a pronounced rudder-like structure at the aft end. Originally built as a luxury liner, a few ships of this class were converted into combat vessels by Alliance techs, upgraded with heavy armor plating, powerful shields, and a variety of turbolasers and ion cannons. The Dauntless could carry 4 squadrons of starfighters and 2 regiments of embarked troops, and it was also known for its top-of-the-line sensor systems. Dauntless heavy cruisers saw occasional use in ship-to-ship combat with the Rebel fleet. Lastly, we have a true Leviathan of the Rebel fleet. After the destruction of the Fortressa, there was only one capital ship class in the Rebel fleet that was larger than the largest Mon Calamari Star Cruisers, the Mark III Bulwark class battlecruiser. The Alliance only had a handful of these behemoths, which were better known as New Republic flagships, but they still saw use as command vessels. Descended from a line of Techno-Union battlecruisers that saw action during the Clone Wars, the Bulwark Mark III was the only true battlecruiser in the Rebel fleet, apart from the Lucrehulk. Designed by Transgalmeg Industries, based on the older Techno-Union Bulwark Mark I, the ship was manufactured by Transgalmeg and also by Sorosub, which built it for the Celestian Home Guard. Some of these ships found their way into Rebel hands, possibly through the Celestians. The Bulwark Mark III was 2,500 meters long and its densely armored main hull was tall and vaguely bullet-like, narrowing at the front and bulging toward the aft with a short fin along its top. The aft engine block was flanked by a set of 4 large flaps of armor plating on outriggers, which, like the main hull, were covered in an extremely dense layer of plating. The Bulwark was armored enough to be able to ram other capital ships with impunity, UNSC Infinity style, and its shields were similarly powerful and extensive. Its hull bristled with turbo lasers, ion cannons, and tractor beam projectors, and it could carry 10 full squadrons of starfighters in its hangars, plus 4 regiments of embarked troops. The Bulwark was practically a space-borne fortress, and it was even capable of landing on a planet to deploy troops, which was unheard of for a ship of its size. It wasn't perfect, of course. It was especially known for frequent electrical and sensor malfunctions, but it was nonetheless extremely tough, able to thrash an Imperial Star Destroyer in a one-on-one fight. The Bulwark Mark III was rarely used by the Alliance, as it had very few of them, and they were acquired shortly before the Battle of Endor. When these battlecruisers did see action though, they usually obliterated whatever Imperial force stood in their way. So, that's our look at the larger vessels of the Rebel fleet. But what do you think? Would you like to see a video on other factions' navies as well? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.